Bueno, entonces, este seminario tiene como objetivo mostrar las distintas situaciones
This
críticas
gathering
que este
has the
sistema
objective
capitalista
of
neoliberal
showing the different
patriarcal
critical situations
colonialista
that this neoliberal
propicia en
capitalist
todos los ámbitos de la
colonial
vida en nuestros
situation
países y
system
las
and
resistencias,
treaty
las
has on
estrategias, las
our
propuestas,
countries and
proyectos,
the
las luchas
strategies
que
and
tenemos como
projects, the
pueblos
struggles that we
para
have
seguir
as
adelante.
peoples in order to continue
Está
forward.
organizado
It
en
is
cuatro
organized
sesiones.
in 4
El jueves
sessions. On
pasado
last
ya
Thursday,
revisamos asuntos
we
relacionados con
focused
el
on
TMEC.
issues related to the
En este
USMCA.
contexto de este mundo que
This
está
session,
permeado
in
por
the context of
invasiones,
this
violaciones
world, which is
fundamentales a la
marked
soberanía de
by
los países,
fundamental
a los derechos
violations of the
humanos, a las
sovereignty
leyes y
of the
derechos
country's human
internacionales,
rights and
a las
international
mismas
laws,
instituciones formadas
and the
para regular las
institutions that
relaciones
have been
entre los
created to
países y
regulate
preservar
the
la paz y
relationships
sobre todo
by
a la
the
preservación de
relationships
la
between
vida
the
del
countries
planeta y de
and
la
to
humanidad.
conserve peace and the life of the
Ejemplos
planet
tenemos de la
are
presencia
carrying out these
supremacista
violations, and what
imperial
um,
en
and
la Gaza
examples of
palestina,
this
en la
supremacy and
existencia del poder de la Casa
imperialism
Blanca en
are
apoderarse de
in
Groenlandia.
Gaza
Ya
and
invadió
in
Venezuela y
the
secuestró a su
United
presidente
States
y a
in
su esposa.
relation to
Y la situación de
Greenland
Cuba,
and
que está en
to
el bloqueo
the
económico,
capture of
comercial y
the
financiero,
Venezuelan
como parece
president
que
and
nunca
his
había
wife.
estado en estas condiciones
We'd
tan
never seen
infrahumanas que
these
están sometiendo
such
a,
infrahuman
a este país
conditions
amigo.
within this
Amenazados Canadá, Colombia,
country that
México
has been
y
a
quieren
friend. And there
vasallos
are
y vasallaje que transite por
threats
América
to
Latina y el Caribe.
Canada and to Mexico
Y
and
más allá
throughout
de la
Latin America
doctrina
and
Monroe
the Caribbean
en su
and beyond the
momento,
Monroe
que no
Doctrine
quería
in
la
its
presencia de
moment,
Europa en nuestro
which they
continente,
did not want the
ahora
presence
se
of Europe in our
suman
continent.
a
Now
esa restricción Rusia, China y
Russia
cualquier otro
and
país
China
del
and
mundo que
any
no
other
acoja
country
sus
in
designios.
the country
Hoy nos
that
embarcaremos en las relaciones
that
de la
does
Unión
not
Europea, de
line
México y
up with
América
its
Latina.
policies are also
El
being
acuerdo global en
restricted.
México con la Unión
The global
Europea
agreement
fue
in
firmado
Mexico
en
with the European Union was signed
1997
in
y
1997,
sellado en
and
materia de
it
comercio en el
entered
año
into
2000.
implementation
Y
in
ahora se
2000.
pretende modernizar.
And now there's a
29
process
años
to
han
modernize it.
pasado y
29
el
years
punto
have gone
central
by,
en
and
las
the
luchas
central
que hemos
point
venido
in the
sosteniendo
struggles that we have
es
been
el tema
sustaining
de los
is
derechos
the issue
humanos.
of human rights.
Y por eso la sesión de hoy tiene que ver
That's why
exactamente
our
con eso.
session today is going to be
Estos
focused on
acuerdos de la
this.
Unión
These
Europea, tanto
agreements
con
of
México
the
como
European
de América
Union with
Latina,
Mexico and
es
and Latin
dónde están
America
esos derechos humanos.
are where
Pero
those human
bueno,
rights are at.
Ulrike Capdepon, ella
Enrique
estará
Capdepon
coordinando esta
is
sesión.
coordinating this
Ella es
session.
profesora
She
del
is a
Servicio Alemán de
professor
Intercambio
at the
Académico y
German
coordinadora del Centro de Estudios
Academic
Europeas
Exchange and
del
coordinator of
Departamento de
European
Estudios
Studies
Ibéricos y
in the
Latinoamericanos
Department
del Centro
of
Universitario
Iberian
de
and Latin
Ciencias
American
Sociales y
Studies
Humanidades de la
and the
Universidad de
Humanities
Guadalajara.
Department in the University
Ella se
of
doctoró en
Guadalajara.
Ciencias Políticas en el Instituto de
And
Estudios
she also
Latinoamericanos en
teaches
la Universidad de
political
Hamburgo y
science
es
in the
colaboradora de
University
la
of
Red
Hamburg
Transatlántica. Pero
and
además
is
tiene otras
coordinator of
muchas
the
virtudes
transatlantic networks.
que
And she has
ya
many
no
other
se las voy
virtues
a
as well
comentar
that
en
I'm
este
not going to
momento
comment at this
y
moment.
ella se queda con
And
el timón de
she
este barco.
is now taking
Muy bien.
over steering
Muchísimas
this
gracias,
ship.
María.
Thank
Gracias
you
por esta
very much,
introducción.
Maria. Thank you for this
Como
introduction.
ya acaba de decir
As Maria has just
déjame
said,
darles la
I want to
más
also
cordial bienvenida.
give you the most cordial welcome.
Buenas tardes, buenos días,
Good afternoon,
dependiendo de
good
dónde se
morning,
están
depending on where you
conectando.
are connecting from.
Pues este seminario de hoy
This
entre los pueblos
seminar today
se va a
between the
centrar, como acaba
peoples
de
is
decir
going
María,
to focus,
en el
as
Acuerdo
Maria has
Global
said,
TLCUEM
on
y la
the
pregunta ¿dónde están los derechos
global
humanos?
agreement between
Entonces, esta
European Union
sesión
and Mexico and
se
where human
centrará
rights
realmente
are
en el
at
llamado,
in that agreement.
en
And
la
so it's going to
llamada
be
modernización del Acuerdo Global
focusing on the
y la
modernization
Unión
of the
Europea.
agreement between
El
Mexico
Tratado de
and the
Libre Comercio
European Union
entró en vigor en el
and
año
the
2000
free
y
trade
que
agreement
lleva
that
años
entered into implementation in the year 2000 and that has been
los efectos
negotiated
de la
for many
política,
years.
como ya acaba de decir María, arancelaria de Trump ha cambiado el escenario en
Trump's actions have changed the geopolitical situation and is shaking up new alliances between Latin America and Europe, but that this new treaty will allow European corporations to continue violating human rights in Mexico, like the right to water. In that sense, the treaty, the free trade agreement between the European Union and Mexico are questions about who is going to be benefiting and what are the interests behind this treaty. That's going to be our focus today. I'm really thankful to have with us four really distinguished experts who are specialists from both sides of the Atlantic, who I will present before each of their presentations. We'll have four presentations today, and we're going to start off with the first one. The first one will be from Gaby Kupas, who has connected from Berlin, and she is doctor in Latin American letters, and she is a member of the editing team for the ILA magazine, which is published in Bonn and in Germany. It's one of the most important publications in Germany that focuses on publishing the social, political, and economic context in Latin America and the relations between Europe and Latin America. She also was a political advisor and the Green group within the parliament in Germany, and also on the relationships between Germany and Latin America. And that has allowed her to follow closely the negotiations between the European Union and Mexico on the free trade agreement and the process to modernize it. So it is an incredible pleasure to pass the microphone to Gaby. Thank you very much, Gaby, for being present here with us.
Yeah, okay. En primer lugar, un saludo, no es de Berlín.
Greetings, not from Berlin, but from Rio Mose, which is more to the south, but still winter here, and the first day of Carnival, the Women's Carnival, which is very important. And I would like to, I'm very happy to have the invitation in this seminar, and I'll say although it'd be better to not have this seminar because if it weren't necessary, but it's very necessary because the situation requires it. And that's not the case just since today. For me personally, it concerns me. I've been concerned about this issue since the mid-1990s, for 36 years. Now there's new aspects which I will speak about, but there's also continuities. And I'm going to explain to you where I see these continuities, which I have seen throughout my time working in the European Parliament as a political advisor. As Ulrike said, since the middle of the 1990s, we discovered the issue of feminicide in Ciudad Juarez. It was concentrated in a city, in a place, in a country in Mexico. Now we know that this exists all over the world, but that was the first place where it was named and called feminicide. And through the work with the parliament and civil society, we tried within the European Parliament to present a report about feminicides. It was strongly rejected by the right in Europe that said this does not exist. I think the Mexican government also said it. This does not exist. It's been invented. We don't speak about that. but we continue speaking about that. And in that same time, there started to be, the issue of the global agreement with Mexico that was being negotiated. And the context of all of this, as background, is on the 1st of January of 1994. NAFTA went into implementation, the agreement between the free trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, but there was also the Zapatista uprising on that same day. And so in Europe, we saw this moment, the idea of multilateralism, which was incarnated in the World Trade Organization. And we saw that wasn't going to work, and so we started to enter into bilateral agreements. And the first of these bilateral agreements was with Mexico. And there began to be many more, and including with the Southern Arc. There's been various with Chile, with Central America. And so there's been a continuation of these treaties with the Global South. And so we've had a number of focuses of our struggles. One has been to stop the wave of feminicides, as well as how to put this into legislation. And the other focus was human rights in general and in relation to the free trade agreement with Mexico. You know that Mexico, the relationship with Mexico and the situation in Mexico in that time was really bad. And there were two actors that we hadn't seen so clearly up until that moment. One is organized crime, and the other was European companies, European corporations, that seem to be very distinct, very different. However, they have something in common. And the European businesses, the European companies, were trying to use Mexico as a low-cost country to be able to pay low-cost salaries and to produce machines and autos to export to United States thanks to NAFTA. And on the other hand, to be able to have security. And so that's why they used security, and they killed workers, and they paid a quota of protection to organized crime, which means that the European companies financed organized crime, something that was really difficult to talk about, but it occurred. And so we saw human rights violations in all of these generations, in all these iterations: the right to life, the right to free organization, also social rights, economic rights, and then environmental rights. What was the response of the European Union? A human rights clause that consists of, I think, 22 words, very, very lovely words, but completely inoperative, without teeth, because it focused first only on the rights of the person, the individual person, and they were not applicable. And so on both sides, both in Mexico and the European Union, used a simulacrum of protecting human rights. Both of the governments carried out a simulacrum of protecting human rights rather than actually improving protection of human rights. At that time, there was very good cooperation between activists in Mexico and Europe. In Mexico, we were able to denounce this situation, and we came together around the slogan, "No more global agreement." No more global NUE agreement. We have NUE was the abbreviation in Spanish, and there was another one in English, but at the end of the 90s, we were able to get recognition of feminicide. We were able to publish a report on feminicides, although the right was boycotting that report up until the very end and introducing an amendment to take the word Mexico out of the title of the report. They did not want to accept that this existed, but we were able to win having the report with the word Mexico, but we lost the campaign against the global agreement. Many companies at that time, like a German company that produced tires, and it wasn't possible for the workers to unionize. But on the Mexican side, there were a lot of people who were active around this issue. On the European side, there were not so many, but those who were active were able to loudly raise their voices, and I think that this helped. At that time, there was also another issue that came up and that really bothered the establishment on both sides, which was the issue of indigenous rights. I remember that in 2000, we went with a delegation to the European Parliament, the meeting between the European Parliament and Mexico, and we went to Chiapas. And the Mexican government did everything possible to impede a meeting between the Europeans and the Zapatistas. It was impossible, and we had to return without having had seen the Zapatistas. But we had really tried. And I mention it because of the opposition of the Mexican government, but also because the president of the delegation at that time was Antonio Seguro. And Antonio Seguro, who is Portuguese, was chosen as president of the Republic of Portugal last Sunday. So we have an ally there, in theory, an important ally, because he's the president of a republic. And since that time, we have had various ideas about how to make this issue visible. One was annual conferences about the issue of feminicides in the European Parliament, always with strong presence, important presence from the other side of the ocean. We didn't have really tangible achievements, but we had a lot of presence in the media. We also had the possibility since 2001 to be present in the World Social Forum, which started in that year and that has been carried out yearly since. And there was also the World Trade Organization in Cancun, which is perhaps a forgotten moment, but it was an important moment to talk about human rights violations at the international level, because with the presence of all of the countries in the world almost, in 2010, there was a terrible case for us, and for you, it was one case of many, but for us, it was emblematic, and it was a case of the assassination of Betty Carino, who was from Chiapas, and Ibiacula was a Finnish citizen who was also assassinated, and that gave us the possibility to call for the identification of those responsible for the murder because she was a European citizen. Nevertheless, up until today, they still have not found those who were responsible for the murders. But we thought, if we go as Europeans and we lift our voices for the punishment for the murder of a European citizen, then that helps to put the process of justice to push it forward, to also be able to find justice for the murders of so many Mexicans as well. Perhaps the best thing that we were able to achieve was that for many people spoke about this case and similar cases, but we weren't able to achieve more than that. 4 years after that was Ayotzinapa, and I think that was like the first time that the whole world realized that something was going wrong in Mexico. And before then, it was kind of isolated groups that were looking at and focusing on Mexico. But at that moment, it was the international press and the international attention everywhere. But even so, this crime has not been resolved, but the Mexican government took a lot of measures to say lies about who had been the murderers. Well, we didn't even know if they were murderers, but of who was responsible for carrying out the disappearances. At that time, we realized that the old methods were perhaps not so good to be able to achieve more public and to achieve more attention about this issue, and we started to seek other ways. And so perhaps amongst the first ones who have done it with success have been the Zapatistas, who came to Europe, for example, in order to denounce the open sky mining in Germany. And I think this was really important, so it could see that Europe wasn't the model and Mexico the third world, that we could mutually nourish each other to find issues that were, to be able to find shared issues in common. And we also carried out in relation to the case of Betin Iri, in order to keep it alive in the memory of many people, we carried out a competition, a painting competition, and other painting and other art focusing on this issue. And we showed the art from this competition in the European Parliament, and that way many people saw it and they spoke about this issue. And that exposition still travels through different countries all over the world, and so this issue is spoken about. And so I think that's important when we see that the answers, the official answers to our demands are very weak. In that time, they started to talk about the modernization of the agreement between Europe and Mexico. For us, the modernization isn't what in alignment with the word modernization, but it is to open up the possibility to intervene in trade, in civil society, and into the regulation of what the large companies do. And so the modernization that they're talking about are various aspects
hacer que las empresas
of
puedan
how
decidir
to achieve the
sobre lo que
possibility
hacen.
for the companies to make
Las
decisions
grandes
about what they
empresas,
do, the
sacar
large
aranceles
corporations,
o
to
mejor protección
be able to
compras
get rid
públicas,
of
mejor
tariffs, to have
protección de
better
propiedad
protection for
intelectual,
their purchases of their intellectual property,
legalizar y promover la
to
inversión
legalize
privada
and
en el sector
promote
energético,
private
o
investment in the
en lo que
energy
explica el
sector.
ISDS y luego el ICS, que es un tribunal sobre inversiones
And the ICS, which is a tribunal
en el cual
about
una
investments
empresa puede
in
demandar
which
a un
a
estado,
company can sue
lo
a
cual
state,
ya ha costado mucho a
which
México,
has already
porque ya ha
had
habido
a lot of
pleitos
costs
en
for
el seno de la
Mexico.
OMC, en el seno
There have been
del Banco Mundial,
a lot
pero aún
of
así ambas partes, tanto los
conflicts
europeos como los
within
mexicanos, han
the center
seguido
of the
esa
World
idea de que
Bank and
eso
other,
tiene que
but
existir
there
y
has
eso
been
va a
insistence
costar
that
muy
this needs
fuerte
to
a los
exist, and
consumidores, a
this
las
is going to have a
personas
lot of
en
impacts on
México.
consumers, on people in Mexico.
En cuanto a la modernización está en
In
curso,
relation
ustedes
to
saben
the
que todavía no
modernization
se
that
sabe
is in
exactamente cuándo,
process, so
pero hay
we
un
still don't
nuevo
know
argumento
exactly
con
when
Trump,
this will happen, but there's a new argument
porque
with Trump because
antes era el tema de
before
las empresas que no
it
era
was the
muy
issue
popular
of
lo que seguía, y
the
ahora
companies that wasn't very popular, but
Trump es
it
el
was there.
pretexto ideal
Now Trump is
para
the
decir,
ideal
mira, tenemos que
pretext,
tener
the ideal
mejores
excuse
conexiones
to be able to
con
say we need better
México, con
connections with
Mercosur, con otros
Mexico,
países del mundo, en
with
contra
the
de
Southern
lo que está
Hemisphere,
haciendo
with
Trump, el
other countries in the
unilateralismo de Trump
world to be able
contra
to
Baluarte.
counter the unilateral approach of Trump.
Estos que lo dicen lo toman como
So
un
those
pretexto
who say
ideal
this, they take
que
this
convence
as
a mucha gente,
an
pero es nada
ideal
más un
pretext that
pretexto.
convinces many people, but it's
Es
just a pretext.
para tener
And this
para
is in
imponer
order
más
to be able to
el
impose
modelo neoliberal.
more fully the neoliberal
¿Qué podemos
model.
hacer?
What
Esta
can
es
we
la gran
do?
pregunta.
That is the big question.
Lo que estaba contando
What I
muestra
was
de que
sharing
los intentos de tener
is that the
leyes es
attempts to
muy
have
difícil.
laws
Lo que por
are very,
ahora
very difficult.
es lo más importante
Right now, the
es
most important thing
no solo
is
hablar entre
not
nosotros,
just
sino
to
gritar.
speak amongst
Y
ourselves, but to
gritar
shout,
conjuntamente
and to
que
shout
esto no es
together
posible.
that this is
Creo
not
que lo
possible.
que siempre
I
ha
think it's what
funcionado
has
es
always
cuando nos
worked
unimos.
is when we come together, when we unite.
Desde los años 90,
Since the
cuando nos unimos
1990s,
en este
when we
caso
unite,
mexicanos y
in this
europeos,
case,
hemos
Mexicans
podido
and
levantar la
Europeans,
voz
we've been able
y
to
decir
raise our
algo y
voices
también
and to be able to say
darnos
something and also
mutuamente
to be
coraje
able to
para seguir.
mutually give
Creo
each
que
other
eso en tiempos de
the
Trump
anger, the courage to continue.
es lo que podemos hacer y lo que tenemos que hacer.
And so this is
Y en
what
ese
we
sentido,
can
ese
do and what we
seminario creo
can
que es
do.
un buen
And so that's why I
ejemplo
think that
de
this
lo que se puede
seminar
hacer
is a
y
good
mucho, y continuamente.
example of what
Muchas gracias.
needs to be done much more. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Gaby. Estás muy bien a tiempo. Te agradezco mucho compartir tus perspectivas,
Very good.
tu
Thank you,
larga
Gabby. You're right
experiencia.
within your
Y
time.
vamos a
Thanks
tener
so very
tiempo
much,
para
Gabby. I appreciate
profundizar,
you sharing your
indagar con
experience.
los
And we'll
comentarios y
have
las preguntas de
time
ustedes.
to go into some
Muchísimas
questions
gracias. Vamos a seguir
uh,
ahora con
by
la
the participants.
segunda intervención.
We'll continue now
Realmente
with the
continuar
second
con
panelist.
la segunda presentación que va a ser que es de Braulio Moro.
We have Braulio
Bienvenido,
Moro.
Braulio. Braulio
Welcome,
Moro es
Braulio.
periodista y doctor en
Braulio
economía.
is
Radica en
journalist
París.
and
O sea, se conecta también
PhD
desde
in
Europa,
economy.
donde también ya es tarde. Es miembro del Buró
He's
Nacional de la
joining us from Europe.
Asociación
He's a member
France-Amérique
of the
Latine
Association
e
France-Amérique
integrante de la
Latine
campaña global por el
and a
control de
member
las
of the
empresas
global campaign
transnacionales.
for
Bueno, directamente
corporate
el micrófono
controls
es tuyo, Braulio,
international
bienvenido.
corporations.
Gracias a todos y a todas. Gracias por
Thank you very
darme
much
esta
to
oportunidad
everyone.
por
Thank you
la
for the
invitación.
opportunity and for your
Quisiera simplemente
invitation.
añadir que además
I
de
wanted to add
los
that
comentarios que tú decías sobre lo que es
beyond
hoy,
what was mentioned in my introduction. Since the end of the 90s, I've also been involved in the campaign against free trade agreements. And Gabby Cooper's presentation has been very interesting. It allows us to look at the trajectory behind all of this and leads us to the question. Mexico has never been a strategic partner for the European Union. Not then, not now. And so the question is, why this free trade agreement? Why, since 1997 or 98, did this type of work begin with the European Union seeking this type of free trade agreement? I think some of us here, perhaps some of us that are older, have some insights into that. But I wanted to provide some comments for the newer generation and add some comments to what Gabby said. In 1994, the NAFTA enters into vigor. Mexico, United States, and Canada. In 1995, 1 year later, the European Council meeting in Madrid launched what it called a new initiative, an agreement for association with Latin American partners. That's 1995. Why? Before the free trade agreement, between the NAFTA agreement, the European Union had 10% of the Mexican market. When the free trade agreement enters in vigor, it reduces the European share of the market in Mexico. And the concern was that this would continue. And they also were concerned about how this would impact other markets. So they developed a free trade agreement with China, Mercosur, the Andean countries. So this was a global strategy on the part of the European Union that takes form in 1995 and whose objective since then has been to preserve, if not increase, its share of the economy market in Latin America. At that time, the Interregional and European Association was proposed, and we have ALCA. So the European Union is always responding. It's responding to whatever's happening in the United States, the policies there, and then also increasingly China. So it's important to keep that in mind to understand why there's this insistence on having a free trade agreement between Mexico and European Union. Mexico is not like the countries in Mercosur. The European Union is not benefiting from our economy as much as it has with these other countries. 700 million people in Mercosur. And the European Union has been much more modest in its ambitions since then. Since 2000, and between then and 2024, so a 24-year period, one generation, the commerce between Mexico and the European Union went from $19 million to $91 billion. So that's in 20 years. 24 years. So take note, it's not a huge increase. I'm sorry, those were both billions, the numbers. What the European Union is doing with Switzerland is much more significant than that. compared to Mexico. Nevertheless, it's served them. But since the start, the European businesses saw in Mexico a trampoline or a launch pad to be able to gain access to the U.S. market, particularly in relation to the low labor costs that this offered. Something significant here is that for the European Union, it was about bringing into a minimum the tariffs that pertain to Europe, that are there for Europe from Mexico. Maria Teresa Mercado in Mexico, you know her well. She is the Subsecretary of Exterior Relations of Mexico. She said in November, in relation to the accord with the European Union, she said that that would be signed in February, the free trade agreement. So that was said in November. Let's keep that in mind. It's important to keep in mind also that that had been developing since 2018. What's interesting to me, and before we enter into human rights topics and how we perceive them, it's important to look at the relations between Mexico and France. That's important because we need to remember that the main commercial allies in Europe are Spain, Germany, Italy, and then after that comes France, then Netherlands, particularly because of the finance sector, and then France, actually. The important free trade agreements between Mexico and France, we're looking at 200 years of diplomatic relations. It represents just 1% of the commercial exchange that Mexico engages with globally. So it's almost zero. But nevertheless, French corporations can enter the market. For instance, Perdus, AXA, Danone, Safran, the automobile corporation. There's Sanofi, there's a chemical corporation, Schneider Electric. I'm sorry, the audio is a bit muffled and it's difficult to hear the names for the interpreter. So when you look at the experience that we've had in this period, in relation to the free trade agreement between Mexico and France, what benefits have come to France? And where are we in terms of human rights? The benefits include that, or rather, when I look at the relations with the relationship with France, everything is favoring France by far. It's 3 times the exports from France to Mexico compared to what Mexico exports to France. And we're seeing this happen in every country, with every country in the European Union. So when you look at the overall numbers, you realize that the exportations from the European Union are much more important than the importations. And as a result, Mexico has a large commercial deficit with the European Union, and that has been exacerbated since the free trade agreement was established. They said it was a win-win situation, but that's not the case. Also, in this terrain, when we look at businesses, the issue of businesses and human rights. And as Gabby mentioned, this is played out in Ayotzinapa. There's also another important case, and that's Acteal. In Mexico, our colleagues that follow this issue will remember that there was a massacre in Acteal, Chiapas, during the Zapatista period. Then one of the initial demands that came from the social organizations in Europe and in Mexico, this during the negotiations, was that the first article should be established to establish protocols for human rights. Those negotiations came to a halt because there was a clear human rights violation happening in Mexico. And so the Mexican government liberated some people, some perpetrators, and then the European Union said that they're going to continue with the negotiations. So this confirmed something. In 1996, or around then, perhaps 1997 is the massacre, then you see this repeat. Situations where there are human rights violations in Mexico. I think that my colleagues here know what happened with Ustari, the tire manufacturer. It had a cooperative in Jalisco. What happened there? This was German capital that violated the rights of workers. And once again, they turned to the European Union and Mexican accords, and they kept moving anyway. Human rights went to the margins. The same thing happened with Spain and the Spanish banks. I remember that they created at the end of the 90s and at the start of the 2000s, from 2001 up to 2006, there is an organization established that provides financing for indigenous communities in Chiapas. And the Spanish banks decided to close those accounts to prevent those funds from reaching the communities in Chiapas. We denounced that action, and yet the free trade agreement moved forward. I could provide some more examples. I want to make it clear that this didn't stop there. There's the case of the human rights violations with the French company IDF in the Isthmus, where you have the largest wind energy project in Latin America. There's a convention that requires free, prior, and informed consent consultations. And they were not enacted in this case by the Mexican government. And that wind power project continues moving forward with the participation of European partners. So, yes, the free trade agreement has benefited Mexico in certain ways, but when it comes to human rights, this is not working. And Gabby has made that very clear. Why was it fair or why did it make sense to oppose the agreement from the start? European authorities, with the support of the Mexican authorities, have allowed for the trade agreements to expand. And this isn't unique to Mexico when we look in Latin America. Or rather, it is unique. It's the only country that has a strategic agreement and a global agreement. And these are two different things. We need to keep that, have that very clear. It's the only country that has that. The only other country in Latin America with which the European Union has a strategic alliance agreement is Brazil. And yet that hasn't been confirmed. There's Mercosur, but Mexico is the only country that has entered into a global alliance that includes cooperation, economic associations with political impacts. And then there's also the strategic alliance agreement that's different. And I think at some point we should discuss that. I would say the following as well. Adding to what we've seen in the last 20 years related to the free trade agreement and understanding that it is being driven by the commercial interests and everything else is marginal, we need to highlight the organizations in Mexico and also in the European Union. We see that human rights as such are not static. Human rights are part of a process. Human rights are part of a process that is in relation with the force of these organizations, the power of these organizations. So what do I mean by that? As you know, at a specific point, the fight for abolition was not part of the human rights movement. Enslaved people were seen as objects, and there had to be the appropriate conditions in order for laws to be developed that would recognize that it was a human right to not be enslaved. With the passing of time, there's also been the recognition of rights for animals. That didn't exist in the past. We also now have rights for children. And so what I'm trying to say here is one of the things that we need to do in order to oppose these free trade agreements, which is something which contaminate and suppress our societies, what we need to do is find ways to, as Gabby was saying, to bring our strength together and also to consider what type of rights do we need to create, new rights. For example, there weren't rights for women in the past. There wasn't a global recognition of that. In the 1970s, there was legislation for removing all forms of discrimination impacting women in the 70s, and we had to mobilize for that to happen. Then there was the International Convention for the Rights of Children, which at one point was not considered an international right. Then the Convention for Rights for Migrant Workers was developed. And so what I'm trying to say here is that we need to think about what kinds of human rights do we need to develop and fight for that would allow us to transform the current situation. One of the things that we've tried to advance in Mexico, in Latin America, in Europe, and in Africa is a binding contract that regulates corporate activities. We've been involved in that. We have opposition from the United States, from the European Union, and from corporations because this is a project that is going to expand the power of human rights. And so we have to think about how we can strengthen that type of work. And to wrap up, I want to say that As we see these free trade agreements, all of these stupid things that are happening around Trump, the European Union sometimes comes out as the great defender of human rights. And I want to remind everyone, when it comes to migration, today, in the Mediterranean is the largest common burial ground in the world. The European Parliament just recently, just yesterday, approved new legislation that permits the creation of detention centers for migrants, just like you have in the United States. And these can be developed outside of the European Union, just like the United States does. So they can send migrants away. So this is part of the reality of the human rights situation in the European Union. So we need to be very conscious of where we're standing, what the challenges are in relation to the European Union and Mexico Free Trade Agreement, in relation to the accords that have to do with Latin America. The project that we started a few years ago that brought together the organizations in the different regions, it wasn't to defend Mexicans, but it was actually about finding ways to empower the different groups regionally in order to oppose this capitalist machine. Thank you very much, Braulio. We appreciate your remarks related to the European Union and human rights, the impacts of these and implications of these free trade agreements that are in question.
I'm going to introduce him again. He is an activist in various social organizations, both at the national level and the international level since 1970, in research and action against free trade agreements and seeking out alternatives since 1991. And he's also a co-founder of the Mexican Network Against Free Trade, and he's also part of the Latin American Network to Counter Free Trade. He is in Ecuador. And from 2012 to 2015, he was part of the advisor on the Presidential Commission in Ecuador regarding free and fair trade agreements. And he is also has a master's in sociology and he has many publications in many languages. And thank you very much for being here and for sharing.
No, gracias a ustedes.
Thank you.
Bueno,
in regard to the specific issue that we're focusing on today, let's say the relationship between the free trade agreements and the respect to human rights, it seems to me that the majority of what can be said has been said. In reality, there is an almost absolute contradiction between human rights and free trade. This is free trade agreements. What they seek is to leave the dynamics of society to the free will of the economy, and that is not compatible with human rights. In fact, all of the theory of human rights was born precisely in order to try to put limits on capitalism, on free trade, on put limits so that the dynamics of society be guided by something stronger. And so if we want respect for human rights, we need to seek other kinds of agreements that are not guided by the free market, but by cooperation, by other principles. In fact, there is not really compatibility in between human rights and the logic of free trade. And as has been named since the first presentation, the cause of human rights in relation to the initial free trade agreement with Europe, the clause had no real effect. It was a beautiful declaration, but no impact. And Europe has not done absolutely anything in relation to human rights violations in Mexico. There was a protest we had in relation to this in which we were repressed and prisoners were taken, both, and when we tried to talk with the European ambassador in Mexico in order to intervene in this repression, and noting that there was that human rights clause, he said, well, that clause is for serious rights, for serious cases, as if the torture to which our companions who were detained were submitted was not a human rights violation. And so the European legislation was obligated to put in this clause, but it has no real effect. And so we're going to see if in the new version of the treaties, if that changes. But the treaty that has been in effect has never been effective beyond a declaration. Nevertheless, certainly from the side of the social movements, it is a lever for struggle in relation to the free trade agreements, and so in that sense, it's good that it's in there. But from my point of view, it has pretty much no effect. And in fact, there's a declaration that I believe is really important to remember of brothers in the Human Rights Commission in the Pacific, carrying out the concrete analysis, going through clause by clause of the treaties, saying that they were incompatible with human rights. And it's not a declaration of an activist or of a revolutionary. It's the declaration of the International Human Rights Commission, which says that there's not compatibility between human rights and the logic of the market. And the market, the logic of human rights is to place limits on the market. And so talking about a free trade agreement and human rights, it's a beautiful phrase, but that's it. I would like to focus my presentation on some things that have not been said by you. What are the main changes that the free trade agreement, this version 2, has
porque no
that
conozco el texto
that
tal
are
cual.
supposed to
Y
have,
más
because
allá
we
de lo
don't
que
know
dice, siempre hay que
all
ver la
the
letra
the text, the
de la
exact
ley. El
text,
tratado es una ley
and also
que hay
the
que ver
draft
exactamente qué dice,
and
porque
the
hay
final version.
muchas
You
trampas y
have to
cosas
see
que no dicen
exactly
en la hoja
what it says, because
de la
sometimes there's
práctica,
things
¿no?
that are proposed that don't
Eh,
end up in there, or that are in there but don't actually get put
digamos,
into practice.
en la revisión que se hizo del Tratado de Libre Comercio,
In the
tiene como
review
vigente
of
de 2000,
the free trade agreement that
que
has
el texto
been
actual
in
del
place since
2025,
2000,
hay demasiados cambios
and
actualmente.
the
Algunos
one that
negociados
was updated in
aún por los
2005.
gobiernos neoliberales de México. Hay una fuerte negociación 2016-2018
There was a
que no
lot
se
of
terminó
negotiation
nunca.
between
Se
2006 and
actualiza el
2008
tratado
that
en
never
2020,
ended. In 2020, the
eh,
treaty was updated,
pero la
but
revisión actual
the current
puede ser
review
interesante conocer el
could be
texto,
interesting
incluso que es la
be able
primera
to see the exact
encabezada
text
por el gobierno de las
and see
cuatro
what's being
transformadas
put forward
por
by
Claudia, ¿no?
the
Se terminó en
government, the Mexican
2025.
government headed
Lo cual
by
quiere decir
Claudia in the
que
fourth
intervino ya el
transformation.
equipo de Claudia, que no es demasiada garantía porque las
But
negociaciones
it's
las lleva
not
el
a
secretario de
big guarantee,
Economía,
because the negotiation is being
es
headed by
pro libre
the
comercio,
Secretary of
aunque en algunas cosas puede
Economy,
ser
and he's
progresista,
pro free
es un hombre
trade.
muy capaz,
He's a
pero
very able man,
nunca se ha opuesto al libre comercio
but
y a
he
la
has never
lógica
opposed
del
free
libre comercio.
trade and
Entonces,
the logic
no
of
tengo
free
demasiada
trade. So I
esperanza que
don't
haya
have a
habido
lot of
cambios.
hope that there have been significant
Sustanciales,
changes.
pero sí creo que
But I think that
la cabeza de Claudia en el gobierno puede haber
with
introducido
Claudia at the
algunas
head of
cosas
the government, there
que
can be some
aminoran
things
el
introduced that
problema del Tratado de Libre
mitigate
Comercio,
the
¿no?
problem of the
Lo
free
que
trade
creo yo,
agreement.
y eso
And what
está
I
planteado
think,
de formal desde el
and
principio,
this has been
que
noted since the
los
beginning,
tratados de libre
that
comercio,
free
mientras
trade
conserven
agreements,
una lógica
while they can serve a
fundamentalmente de
logic
mercado,
that is fundamentally a
son
market logic,
incompatibles con lo que
they're
uno desea.
incompatible with
Eso no quiere decir que los
human
países
rights.
tengamos que estar cerrados
And that
al mundo y no
doesn't
tengamos
mean that that countries need to be
fuertes
closed off to
relaciones
the
y
world, or
alianzas
that, we need
internacionales,
to cut
sino que
off our
se tiene que
international
hacer desde una
relationships, but
lógica distinta
we
a la
need to
comercial.
carry out a
El
trade
sentido
based
lógico
on
que
a
podría
different
pensarnos es que
framework.
parecieran los tratados. No creo que sean
I
reformables.
don't think that these treaties are
Pueden mejorar,
reformable.
pero ser
They
menos
can be
dañosos
improved to
para
be
nuestra
less
población,
harmful
pero
to
no
the
buenos para
population,
nuestra población.
but
Si
not
queremos
actually
una
be
relación
good for our
internacional
population.
con
If we want
Europa
to have
de otra
international
lógica
relationships with
política
Europe based on a
de los
different
pueblos,
framework, a different
tendríamos
logic,
que negociar
focused
otro tipo
on
de
the
acuerdos
peoples, then we have
que
to
podemos llamar de
negotiate a
cooperación,
whole
¿no?
different kind of
Y
agreement that could
bueno,
actually be called
eso
cooperation.
sobre la relación con derechos humanos que ustedes
In
ya trataron muy bien
relation to the issue of
no
human
me
rights that you
alargo,
already
¿no?
spoke
Eh,
about very
hay,
clearly,
por lo menos por el
and for
índice
that
que
reason,
se
I
pudo
won't go on
traducir
too
del
long.
nuevo acuerdo, hay una
In the
enorme cantidad
index
de
of
capítulos nuevos,
the new
muchos
treaty, there's
reformados,
many new
y en
chapters, and
algunas
there's many who have
explícitamente se
been
dice que se
reformulated,
reformaron en
and there's a number
2025,
that
ya
were
con
reformulated
esta
in
lógica
2005,
la presidencia de Claudia, que son los siguientes, ¿no?
and
Materias
now we
primas,
have
derechos a regular el
there's
sector
one focused
energético,
on prime
el comercio y
materials, on
desarrollo
raw materials,
sostenible, las
sustainable
reglas
development,
aranceles, todos esos son nuevos.
and all of
Hechos en
these are new.
2025. Hay unas notas introductorias a las reglas de
In
origen,
2005, there was an
y
introductory note
sobre
on the
productos
laws of
especiales
origin,
también. Y
about
esto me
special
parece
products as
importante
well. And
porque
I think that this
parte
is
de los
important
problemas que
because
en México,
part of the issues in
digo, hay que ver
Mexico,
cómo se renegociaron, si
we'll
quedaron
have to see how they're
más
renegotiated,
buenos,
but
malas,
if
o
they
realmente es un cambio
stay,
sustancial.
still
Pero
more or less better,
buena
if they're actually
parte de los pocos
substantially better
efectos
or different.
positivos que han tenido los tratados de
But
libre comercio en México y
some of
en
the positive
particular en la
effects that the
europea
treaties have had
es la poca
in Mexico and in Europe
concatenación entre el sector exportador y el resto de la economía.
And
Las
there's been
exportaciones tienen muy poco
little
consumo mexicano.
coordination between exports and the
Supongo que
rest of the
hasta por
economy. There's
tiempo,
very
también con
little
Europa,
content
en
in the
realidad
exports of Mexico to Europe.
se viene a aprovechar la mano de obra barata
And Europe really comes in to take advantage of
los
the
140
low
años de
salaries,
como
to take
consumidores,
advantage of the workers
pero al no
in
tener
Mexico and the
capacitación en las
market
dos
as
fuerzas productivas, tienen muy poco
consumers.
efecto en el empleo y
But
muy
since,
poco efecto
Mexico
en el crecimiento de la
it has,
economía.
really low
Entonces hay que
effect on
ver
the growth of the
cómo crear las
economy.
reglas de origen
It has really low effect on
que en todas las versiones
growth and
anteriores de todos
employment.
los TLCs que yo conozco, tanto de México como
And,
del
of
resto de
all
América
of the free
Latina,
trade agreements that I know of
las
in
reglas de
Mexico
origen
and other
se
free
supone
trade agreements,
que
the laws
deberían
of
de regular
origin are
cuando un
supposed to be
producto
regulated
mexicano
when a
importado
Mexican
entraría a Europa
product would,
con
enter
las
into
ventajas arancelarias,
Europe
¿no?
with
Pero no es
tariff
así.
advantages, but that's
Las
not the
reglas de
case.
origen se definen como
The laws
reglas
of
de origen
origin
regional
are supposed to focus
y
on
que
the
pueden
regional
cumplir con el
level.
porcentaje regional de
And
producto
so you can
y que son muy
comply
poco
with the
mexicanos,
regional
¿no?
percentage of
Es decir, que en el caso
products
del
that aren't
TLC con
necessarily
Estados Unidos
Mexican. So
pueden venir
with
la
the
mayoría de los
free trade
insumos de
agreement
Estados
with the United
Unidos,
States, the majority of the inputs
aprovechar
can
la mano
come
de obra
from
mexicana
the United
y
States
no
and
tener
take
tantos
advantage
inconvenientes
of the
internacionales, pero
low
cumplen con las reglas de
salaries in,
origen
Mexico,
porque son
but
productos
they're
que
able
vienen de
to,
parte de otro país.
comply
Es el
with
mismo caso en
this
Europa en
law
el caso
of
automotriz, por
laws of
ejemplo,
origin
¿no?
because it's a product
Entonces,
that's coming
¿cómo
from,
pueden las
the
reglas de
region Mexico,
origen
US,
en esta
and
nueva
Canada. And
versión
so
puede ser
it
importante
could be important to
para
see how the laws
disminuir los
of
efectos
origin are
negativos
addressed in
o
this new
lograr
version to see if
ciertos
it's going to
efectos
have
positivos en
still
cada
have
elemento
negative effects, or
productivo
if they're
del
going to
sector
have
exportador,
some
que
positive effect to
México
increase
realmente
the
le importa
exports
la
from
economía,
Mexico,
¿no?
because the exports in Mexico are
Como
really,
bueno,
the
esos
motor
son
of the
los
economy.
capítulos revisados en
Those are some
2025,
the chapters that
pero
had
creo que
revisions
tenemos que, para
in
hacer un balance
2005, but I think
por dónde va la negociación
to really look at
y para
where
poder dar la
the
lista de los
negotiation
planteamientos, porque no se apruebe o se
is going,
modifique
and to be able to
más
carry a struggle so
sustantivamente,
that the
pues tenemos
Parliament
que hacer el análisis
approves
del
it, and we
texto,
really have to do
lo
an
cual
analysis of the
es
text,
bastante
which
complicado
is very
y
complicated
largo de hacer,
and
¿no?
long.
Bueno, tenemos muchísimas declaraciones de los dos
We
lados del
have a lot
Atlántico
of
sobre
declarations
las
from both sides of the
maravillosas
Atlantic about the wonderful
beneficios de esta nueva
benefits
negociación
that this
que
new
se presume. ¿Qué es lo que se
negotiation
presume? ¿No?
is going to have,
Lo
well, is
primero es que
presumed will
se
have.
dice que se amplía
First,
el
they
acceso
say
de
that they're
productos agrícolas.
expanding the access to
Tanto
agricultural
en México
products,
como en Europa lo
both
que
in
he podido
Mexico
ver
as well as
no
in
te
Europe.
dice claramente si
Although
el
I've been
acceso de
seeing
productos
they're
agrícolas
not
europeos a
clearly saying
México
if
o de
it's
México a Europa
access of products from
se
Europe to
migra el
Mexico or
famoso
Mexico
retiro
to
de
Europe.
aranceles de algunos productos importantes de
It'll,
México
take
que van a
tariffs
Europa,
off some of the
pero
important products that go from Mexico to
viéndoles
Europe,
una novedad que se presume como positiva,
but this
creo
will be
que al leer el
this will be an
texto
innovation.
sin negar que es bueno ampliar los mercados agrícolas externos de México, ello, digamos, hay que ver
We'll have to
hasta
see
dónde
up
esto
to
no
what
pone en
point
riesgo
this
la
doesn't
seguridad y la
put,
soberanía alimentaria. ¿No?
put in
Es
risk
decir, de nuevo
food
nos
sovereignty.
remitimos al texto concreto para ver
And we really need to see the
esta
concrete
ampliación
text in order to
del
see if
acceso a productos
this
agrícolas mexicanos a
will
Europa
place pressure
es o no es
on
positivo.
if
Porque el
this
acceso es de
change
dos
in
vías,
the
también
access
hay
of
que
agricultural
recalcar.
products between Mexico and Europe is
Se
positive or
considera
not.
un capítulo sobre pymes, y eso se presume mucho en México, sobre comercio digital, sobre anticorrupción,
There's also
sobre desarrollo
changes to a chapter
sustentable,
that they're saying will be good for
pero
sustainable development, for reducing corruption
digamos,
in Mexico.
uno se pregunta cuántas pymes
One,
realmente
asks
tienen capacidad
how much
infraestructura
capacity
de
there
acceder a los
is
mercados internacionales
in relation
sin
to the
una
structure
política gubernamental directa que lo
of
favorezca.
international economics and how much that will change the impacts of local government structures. And we'll have to look at the specific public policies that could give results in relation to this. There's also substantial changes to the chapter on public purchases, and this would be reciprocal, which seems to me is a really serious issue because the public purchases and the public companies, at least a large part of the history of Mexico, have really been a lever of development and growth in the economy. To the extent to which these public purchases are internationalized, we lose the weight of the state to be able to favor the growth and the development. And so I think more than presuming that opening up the public purchases will be good, that we'd need to be concerned about that. In terms of investments, they're also saying that there will be an end to the measure of resolving disputes in the CIADI through the WTO. I think this change is positive, but we need to see the small writing on the treaty to see up to what point this can be a positive change or not. What I think is really important is that generally the opposition to the treaties has focused a lot on this mechanism for resolution of controversies, as if we change this mechanism of resolution of controversies, then it would make free trade agreements good. And I don't think that that's true. Any mechanism for resolving controversies, even when it's going to be for judges, rather, whether it's judges or arbiters, it's, who is deciding this? If I signed and I decide to put in my contract that I'm renting a house and every year I'm going to increase my rent double, I can say that that's unjust, that that's illegal, that that's an abuse, a terrible abuse of power, but I signed the contract. The judge or the arbiter is going to say, well, that contract is absurd, it's unjust, it's invalid, it's abusive, but you signed it. So you are obligated to comply with it. So I think that the problem is in the content of the treaty and not just in the mechanism to resolve controversies. The mechanism to resolve controversy has been horrible, it's been corrupt, it's been arbitrary, it has a lot of issues. All of the CIADI and the other different arbitration mechanisms have had a lot of issues, but more than that, the issue is the contents of the treaty itself. So, recognizing this, we need, once again, to be able to read the text to see what the impact really will be. And I would like to say a few words about how it's gone with this treaty with Europe. And I think it's really important, even if it's briefly, through the empirical results that this treaty has had with Mexico, which is where we can evaluate if the modifications of the second version
realmente resuelven los problemas,
really resolve
aunque
the
creo
problems,
que
although I think that
anticipar
we can
que el
anticipate
problema está en la
that the
lógica misma
problem
de
is
los
in the
tratados
framework
y
of
no
the
en
treaties
cambios
themselves and not
puntuales.
in small
Pero
changes.
bueno, veamos
But
algunos resultados,
let's
¿no?
look at some of the results.
Y es verdad, y
And
han
it's
presumido en México por
true,
arriba y
and
por abajo,
Mexico
que
has
las
trumpeted this
exportaciones en la
high and
defensa
low,
fuera de
that the
México ha crecido
protection to
espectacularmente.
with these protections, foreign investment in
Pero
Mexico
no
has
dicen mucho que también las
spectacularly
importaciones han
increased.
crecido aún más
But the
espectacularmente.
importations have
En el caso
also
del tratado
grown
con
even more
Estados Unidos,
spectacularly, and they don't
hemos
talk about
superado en
that.
comercial
In
prácticamente todos
the
los
treaty
años,
with United
pero
States,
eso lo teníamos desde antes del TLC.
even before
Pero en el caso con
the
Europa,
free trade agreement, we had
prácticamente
lots of
todo el tiempo de
importations.
vigencia del
But
tratado.
with the
Y
treaty
desde
with Europe,
1980 para acá,
like
tenemos
since it's
déficit
been
comercial.
in effect, we've had a debt
Entonces, el
to
Tratado de
Europe.
Libre Comercio lo
And
único
so
que hizo fue agudizar ese déficit comercial.
the free trade agreement
Y
only
de
made
hecho,
that
con el
worse.
periodo de vigencia del Tratado de Libre Comercio
And
con
during the
Europa,
time in which
solo
the
en
free trade agreement has
2020
been in
tuvimos
effect,
superávit comercial con Europa. Todos los
only
demás años
in 2020 where
ha
did we
sido
have credit with Europe.
catastrófico en términos
Every
de la
other
cantidad
year,
de dinero que se pierde.
the amount of money that
Algunos
has
datos
lost
los
has
doy
been
en porcentaje del
catastrophic.
PIB
In
para,
terms of the
digamos,
GDP,
disminuir la diferencia de los tamaños de las economías, visto como diferencia las exportaciones
we've
o
seen a
el
real
déficit comercial
difference
en este caso
in
sobre el
the commercial
porcentaje del
deficit
conjunto de la economía
when we look
cada
at the
año
overall economy
de
every
ahí.
year.
Desde 2024,
Since
en promedio,
2024, and on
México ha
average,
tenido un déficit con
Mexico
Europa
has had a
en
deficit
comercio y servicios, o sea, no
with
solo
Europe
mercancías, sino
in
también
trade and in services,
de
not just in
1.2%
merchandise,
de nuestro PIB.
of
En
1.2% of our
2024, la
GDP.
balanza a favor de Europa es
In 2024, that
4.3% de
the
nuestro PIB.
balance in favor of Europe was
Entonces, aunque se ha
4.3%
abierto el comercio
of
y
our
aunque se hayan
GDP.
aumentado las
And so
exportaciones, esto en realidad ha significado salida
even
de
if
dinero de
even
México
if
hacia Europa.
investment has increased in
Eh,
Mexico, we've had more money going out from Mexico
Hay
to
que
Europe.
reconocer también
And we have to
que
recognize
México
as well
exporta
that in
fundamentalmente manufacturas,
Mexico
a diferencia de buena
exports
parte de lo que es
primarily
América Latina,
things that are
que exporta
manufactured,
productos primarios. Pero
and
aún así, que México
whereas
tiene
other
una gran
parts
industrialización,
of
solo
Latin
comparable con
America
Brasil y América
export
Latina,
primarily raw
en realidad
materials.
nuestro comercio con Europa significa salida de dinero
However,
de México hacia Europa.
our commerce, our commerce with Europe
Por el cambio
primarily
comercial,
implies that
aparte de
money is
comida,
leaving
aparte de
Mexico
inversión,
to
aparte de muchas cosas.
Mexico
Bueno,
to
con el
Europe.
Tratado de Libre Comercio
The free
con
trade
Europa,
agreement with Europe
tampoco se lograron diversificar nuestras exportaciones.
has
Esa
not
fue alguna
allowed
de las
Mexico
cosas
to
que presunieron
diversify its
mucho.
exportations, which
Estamos
is one of the
demasiado
things
amarrados
that
a Estados Unidos.
Mexico has
Eso es
said would
peligroso, como
happen.
lo muestra ahora la época Trump.
And,
Es
focusing only on the United
especialmente
States can
peligroso
be
estar tan amarrado a
important. Being
Estados
tied up,
Unidos.
as this time with Trump is showing, to be so tied just to the
Siempre,
United
pero ahora
States
con Trump me
can be
parece que
dangerous. That's always been true,
es
but now with
especialmente
Trump, it
claro.
seems to me that it's
Se supone que el
especially
tratado con Europa iba
dangerous.
a diversificar nuestra
And so
dependencia
being able to diversify our
para no estar tan
dependence,
amarrados a
to
Estados
not be
Unidos.
so
Esto
tied to the
no
United
se dio.
States, that didn't actually
No se
happen
logra
through the free trade
diversificar el
agreement
comercio
with Europe.
mexicano. La misma Secretaría de Economía mexicana reconoce que el 83% de la exportación mexicana
3% of
son
the
a Estados
exports
Unidos.
of Mexico are to the
Esto
United States, and even
lo dice
official
el 16
sources
de
shows
enero
that.
de 2026. O sea,
And
ahorita,
that's up to
con
January
todas las
of this year.
modificaciones del tratado con Europa, con todo y
Even
todo,
with
el
the free trade
83% de
agreement
las
with Europe
exportaciones
and everything,
son a Estados
83%
Unidos.
of our exports are to
Por
the
eso
United
no tenemos
States.
superávit comercial, pero de todos
And we
modos
have a
estamos
trade
amarrados a
agreement with
Estados
the
Unidos.
US, but we're
Esa es la
still
difícil
tied
situación
to the
con
United
Trump.
States.
Además, las
And
exportaciones
this
de
makes the
México a
situation with Trump more
Europa
difficult.
están altamente concentradas en Alemania y España.
The exports of Mexico to Europe are highly concentrated in Germany and in Spain,
A otros países, pues, pero
to a
fundamentalmente
few other countries as well, but they're mainly in
no
those
es un tratado
countries.
con
And
Europa.
it's not so much a
Los
treaty with
beneficiarios de estos
Europe.
tratados
Those who
es
are
Alemania
benefiting
y
are
España.
Germany and Spain.
En todos los años del Tratado de Libre
And
Comercio
all
con
of the years of
Europa,
the free trade agreement with
estos
Europe,
dos países
these two
concentran
countries
más de la mitad de las
have
exportaciones de México.
concentrated, you
Son
know,
los países de los
the majority of
que
more than half of the exports.
sí, ya voy a
Oh,
cerrar,
Alberto,
perdón.
can you begin to close up
Se
your
supone, pues,
presentation?
que el
Yes,
modelo
I will
neoliberal
close.
mexicano,
It's
las exportaciones
supposedly
eran el motor de la
in the
economía, pero esto no ha
neoliberal
sido así.
market in
Las
Mexico,
consultoras
exports would be the
farmacéuticas.
motor of the economy, but that has not been
Termino con el
true.
caso de las
And I will
inversiones, ¿no?
close with the case of
La inversión
investments.
de la Unión Europea en
The
México
investment of the
también ha
European
crecido
Union in Mexico
exponencialmente.
has also grown
En la primera década
exponentially.
del
In the
tratado con
first
Europa
decade of the treaty
se
with
exportaban
Europe, they
7.991 millones de dólares
exported
anuales en promedio, y en
a
el
certain
último año
a
del
number
que hay
of billions
noticias, que es
of
2024,
dollars.
son 158.000 millones de dólares en producto. Lo que
And
se
in this
exporta,
last year,
que puede
it's
significar
been
28.000 comparado con 7.000 millones de dólares al año. También está altamente concentrada en España,
158,000,
Alemania y Países Bajos. En los últimos 5
which
años
has
y
been
medio,
28
de
to
2020
7.
para acá, Alemania
And then
y
from
España concentran 2
2020 to
tercios de la
now,
inversión europea en México.
Spain and Germany
Cuando en la
concentrate
primera
2/3
década
of the exports
del tratado
to
eran 3/4
Europe,
del total. O sea, no
and
es
it was
significativamente.
three-quarters at the
Sin
beginning, so it
embargo, sigue
hasn't
siendo la
significantly
mitad
shifted.
de lo que significa el
For
TLCUEM.
being the
O sea,
half
también para México la relación con Europa no resulta
of this, the
fundamental.
this treaty
Sí
with
es
Europe has
satánico,
not been
sí atrae
fundamental.
inversión
Like,
extranjera,
yes, it
pero la
has
inversión extranjera
meant
europea
exports.
es menos
Yes,
de
it
la
has
mitad
brought
de lo
in
que
foreign
llega de
investment,
Estados Unidos.
but it's less than half of what arrives from
Por
the United
supuesto,
States.
la Unión Europea
And of course,
también ha
the European
abusado
Union
del
has
mecanismo de
also
solución de controversias,
abused the mechanism for the
de
resolution of
55 demandas
controversies
inversionistas,
of
12
57
son de la Unión
de-
Europea y
demands
todas
carried
han
out by
perdido por México,
investors.
¿no?
12
Entonces,
have been
ya
from
sabes, es un
Europe,
mecanismo
and
que no
Mexico
ha sido
has
benéfico
lost
para México.
all of them. So certainly it's
Eh,
not a mechanism that has been beneficial for
Bueno, se me acabó el tiempo,
Mexico.
nomás déjame ver si hay algo de la última filmina que yo tenía.
And I will see if there's
Eh,
any last things to say, and my time is
bueno,
running out.
lo que quiero decir es
What I
que,
want to say
en
is that,
resumen,
in
la lógica del
summary,
libre comercio es lo que hay
the
que
logic
romper.
of
Hay
free
que
trade
buscar
is what we
acuerdos de
have to
cooperación.
end. We have to seek
Hay que
out
poner de ver a los derechos humanos
cooperation
en el
agreements,
centro,
and we
cosa
need
que
to
no
put
está
human
ni en
rights
este
in the
ni
center,
en la vieja
which
versión.
is not going to
Y
be
en ese
either
sentido
in
no
the
hay que
old or the
ponerle parches
new
con nuevas
version. And so you
renegociaciones de
can't,
estos tratados,
just patch up
no
these
pensar que
treaties
nuestra
with new
relación
chapters,
internacional con
but we
Europa
need to really
estén
rethink
basados
the
en otra idea.
relationship between
Gracias.
Mexico and Europe with a different framework.
Muy bien,
Thank
muchas
you.
gracias. Tenemos aquí una mano
Thank you very
electrónica
much.
levantada
We
de
have
Elías
someone raising
García.
their hand, Elias
Te
Garcia.
invito que pues puedes hacer tu comentario, por favor, o pregunta que sea.
Please make your comment or question.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, la pregunta concreta es si pudieran ayudarnos nuestros
Thank you very
ponentes
much.
a
The question
abundar un poco
is
más sobre la
if the
similitud
panelists
o
could,
similitud
if they
entre
could
este
speak to
mecanismo
any
que tiene
similarities
el
between
mecanismo
this
laboral de respuesta rápida
mechanism,
que tiene el TMEC
the quick response
comparado
mechanism
con el
in
Tratado
the USMCA,
de Libre Comercio con la Unión
and
Europea, ¿no? Con su
the free trade
mecanismo
agreement
para
with the
resolver
European
controversias,
Union,
qué similitudes hay,
specifically
qué
about
oportunidades
the
hay
mechanism
para
for rapid
poder
response,
fortalecer mecanismos que
and
ayuden
what
a resolver
can be done to strengthen these
controversias,
types of mechanisms to resolve
sobre todo con
conflicts,
la Unión Europea,
particularly in
si hay
regards
algo
to the
parecido
European
que
Union.
puede trabajar o
Is there anything out
aportar
there that we should be
nuevos
aware of?
procesos de
Anything that
reflexión, de
can
negociación con
provide
la Unión Europea
insights
para atendiendo a la cantidad de empresas que tenemos en México
keeping in mind
de este
all of the
tamaño.
companies in Mexico.
Mira, yo creo que es muy importante la pregunta que
I think this
haces.
is a really important
Este
question.
mecanismo de respuesta
The
rápida,
rapid
en el
response
caso del TLCUEM
mechanism
con
in
Estados
the
Unidos,
case of
fue
free trade
fruto
agreement with
de
the
una
United States
alianza y una
came out
lucha
of an
entre los
alliance
sindicatos mexicanos y los sindicatos
and a
norteamericanos.
union
Y
struggle
nace
involving
en cuanto
the
que
U.S.
sobre todo los
unions.
automotrices de Estados Unidos no tenían forma de
The
competir
automobile
con los bajos salarios
industry
mexicanos,
didn't have a way to
que
compete
y en
with the
ese
labor
sentido buena
costs
parte de las
outside of the
inversiones
country.
nuevas
And
de
so
automotrices en Estados Unidos están
a lot of
viniendo a
the new
México.
investments are directed towards
Todas las
Mexico
tratan de
in that
detener.
industry.
Y en el momento de la aprobación del TMEC,
When
digamos,
the
los
USMCA was
demócratas están en
approved,
poder, bueno,
the
están en
Democrats were in
oposición,
power,
pero y hay una fuerte presencia de los sindicatos del
that's
gobierno de
just when
México.
Trump enters.
Eso fue el origen de ese
And
acuerdo.
that's when you have this
Y de hecho
mobilization
sí ha
from
tenido
the
algunas
automobile
repercusiones,
unions. It has had
porque
some effective
digamos lo
results.
que básicamente eh, legisla o trata de encontrar respuestas es a los bajos salarios en México,
It
pero
addresses
para eso
the
lo
low
que pone el acento el acuerdo de
wage
respuesta
rates,
rápida
the low
es
labor
en la
rates
democracia
in
sindical.
Mexico.
Y
And
la
it
lógica
also
es
speaks
que
to
si hay
union
democracia sindical en
democracy.
México, si acabamos
If
con los
you have that
sindicatos
democracy, union
oficialistas
democracy in
o
Mexico,
charros,
and
como
we were
decimos
to
nosotros,
end
¿no?
all of
Coordinados por el
the
patrón
parallel
o el gobierno,
unions or all of
la
the
lucha
corrupt
obrera logrará los aumentos
unions,
salariales, ¿no?
then we would be able to
Entonces, el
raise
centro
those
del acuerdo
salaries.
laboral y de esto de respuesta rápida está en la democracia sindical,
So the effectivity
en
of the
luchar
rapid
por la
response
democracia sindical
mechanism
y en
depends
sancionar cuando
on
no hay
that
democracia.
union democracy,
Y de hecho ha
on the
habido casos
existence of union
exitosos
democracy.
en que la elección
There
de
have
los
been
nuevos
successful
dirigentes
cases
han estado amañadas con mano de la empresa metida, comprado los votos, y esto lo ha echado para atrás
where
el
people's
acuerdo
votes are
de
bought out
cooperación laboral y el
and there's a
punto de respuesta
co-optation
rápida.
of
Ahora,
the labor
comparando con Europa,
union.
con el tratado con Europa, ni siquiera se mete en el tema laboral, no es, no hay un capítulo de derechos
The
laborales,
agreements in the European
no hay
Union
un
don't even
capítulo
touch
ambiental
that issue.
expresamente,
There is not a
que
chapter
sí tiene
dedicated
Estados Unidos,
to the
pero
unions
no es porque Estados
like what
Unidos
you
sea
see in
buenito,
the United States. But
sino
it's not
por la
because the
lucha de
United
nuestros
States is
aliados en
a little
Estados
angel
Unidos,
here. It has to do
apoyados
with
por México.
the union struggle in the United States, which is supported,
Muchas
has been
gracias.
supported by the Mexican
Am,
union movement as well.
Pues, Braulio, ¿es una respuesta directamente a la pregunta? Sí, ¿no?
Thank you. Claudio, do you want to respond to the
Adelante,
question?
entonces, por favor.
Please go ahead.
Muy rápidamente, como
Yes, very
Alberto lo acaba de
briefly,
señalar,
as
este tipo
Alberto
de
just
dispositivo no
mentioned,
existe en el acuerdo
these types of
entre la Unión
mechanisms don't
Europea y
exist in
México.
the European
Y desde
Union
lo que se basa
Mexico
la Unión Europea, y
agreement.
esto es interesante,
It's interesting
es
that for the
México
European
parte de la
Union,
OCDE,
they
Organización
recognize
para la
Mexico as
Cooperación y
the
Desarrollo Económico,
OECD,
que tiene
economic
cláusulas
development
donde en el caso de violación de los
alliance that
derechos
has
hay que
clauses
recurrir
for
a los puntos
violation of
de la
human
OCDE
rights.
en el país
When that
correspondiente.
happens,
Y
it
todos los
has
países de la Unión Europea, a
is
excepción de la
directed
Unión
to the
Europea,
mechanisms, the
y
national
México,
mechanisms in each
a ser parte
country.
de la Unión Europea,
So
tiene puntos de
Mexico is
referencia
involved with the
sobre
European
violación
Union, and there are
sobre
specific
derechos en
terms
México.
about
Entonces, si
human
ustedes
rights
tienen un
violations
problema,
in
se supone
Mexico.
que hay que
If there's a
recurrir a
problem,
ese punto
you're
de
supposed to
referencia de la
refer to
OCDE
those
para decir, me están violando mis derechos. Eso
entities
sucedió, para que
and
lo tengan
direct your
presente,
complaints
con
there,
la movilización
and
de los trabajadores del
and that's where
campo.
they're resolved or addressed.
Y en cada caso
In each
fue
case,
simplemente la OCDE pues
the
sí, le daba
OCD
entrada al trámite, pero decía,
would
este es un
engage
problema
the matter
entre una empresa privada,
and
entonces la
ultimately say,
OCDE
well,
como tal
this
no
has to
puede
do with a
intervenir
private
en un
business,
caso parecido. Esto es lo que
and
yo
so
conozco del asunto.
they would
¿Querías
redirect it
intervenir?
elsewhere. That's my understanding.
Simplemente decir que
Yes, I just
como
wanted to
no
say
hay
that
ninguna cláusula
since
de
there aren't any
derechos de las
clauses
empresas
concerning the
como
rights for
para
businesses or
aplicar
business
esta
rights,
cláusula contra empresas,
and
porque existe
since
alguna
that
legislación en
clause
Europa
can't
como
be
proyecto de vida vigencia,
directed
pero en
towards the
este
companies
contexto,
and so that the
aquí y
companies are
ahora,
responsible for that, for
están
addressing that,
desmantelando esto. Hace muy poco que entró en vigor, por ejemplo, esa ley
What's
de
happening now
vivienda
is they're
de emergencia,
dismantling
tanto
the
en
very
Europa
idea
como también en países
with
individuales
the
como el mío,
passage
Alemania,
of the law
pero cómo lo
in
están
Europe,
desmantelando,
also in
se
countries
ve
like Germany.
claramente que
You see
esto
that
va a acabar en
dismantling.
nada. Entonces, ahí
They're
no hay
trying to remove
vía
it
hacia futuro.
completely, and so there is no clear path there,
Gracias,
no
Gaby. Muy
opportunity.
importante. Vamos a seguir con la
Thank you
siguiente
very much.
pregunta. Creo que
We'll go to the next
el siguiente
question.
que levantó la mano fue Pablo de
We
Taula
have
Mexic.
Pablo with his hand
Pablo,
raised
¿estarás en
from
Barcelona?
Taula
Dale.
Mexic. I
Excelente.
believe he's in Barcelona. Please go ahead.
Comentario, pregunta, por favor.
Es una pregunta. Me
Ujú.
gustaría,
Yes, I
bueno,
have a
primero que nada,
question.
agradecer el
First
espacio,
of all, I want to thank you
el
for
afán,
organizing
por poner los
this
derechos
event
humanos por
and
delante
for
de
your
las relaciones
interest in
comerciales
putting
en la
human
relación bilateral.
rights before commercial
Mi pregunta
interests.
es esta. ¿Cómo construir un sujeto político colectivo transnacional que permita
My question,
vincular las
how do
graves
we create
violaciones a
a
derechos humanos en
collective
México,
political
la
subject
destrucción del medio ambiente,
that is
con
transnational and is able
el
to
ataque a las
address the human
intereses
rights violations in
económicos en
Mexico,
Europa?
the destruction of the
¿Qué quiero
environment,
decir?
and address the
Varios de los que están
economic
aquí presentes hace
interests that are
23
coming from
años,
Europe?
cuando el
What I
Acuerdo
mean
Global Marco de la
to
Unión Europea apenas comenzaba,
say with this question, or what I
dentro
want
del marco
to
de foros de sociedad civil
highlight,
plantearon
is
varias
that
inquietudes, ¿no?
within
Donde
civil
decían
society,
claramente, pongamos por
there was a
delante
lot of concerns that
lo
were
político como tal,
expressed.
la política y la cooperación, pongamos los derechos
Let's
humanos por
put
delante de la relación
human
comercial.
rights
¿No? O sea,
ahead
ustedes que
of
están
the
aquí
commercial
lo dijeron
policy.
con claridad.
And
Y
that
estos
has
foros de
been
sociedad civil se
expressed
fueron
clearly
desgastando
here in
poco
this
a poco,
space.
¿no? Pero no quedaron en esos esfuerzos que se desgastaron porque
And
parecía
that
que se
effort
convirtieron en foros
seemed to lose its
de
steam.
recuento de daños más que de propuestas, sí que generaron propuestas que se fueron retomando poco a poco, ¿no?
Proposals
Tal
were
como la cooperación
developed,
bilateral
and those
política
were
y de
taken
cooperación
up bit
México-Unión
by
Europea
bit.
generó varios foros sectoriales de derechos
There was a
humanos, de
lot
seguridad,
of
de comercio,
sectors
de
that came
inversiones,
together
hasta del
in,
tráfico aéreo, ¿no?
in
Finalmente
areas
todos
of
los mecanismos que fueron
investment and
establecidos en
carry in
función de
areas of
la relación
commerce.
política, la creación de
There were
cooperación entre México y la
places
Unión
where there was
Europea.
more cooperation
Y
between
por eso
Mexico and
planteo
the
esta
European
pregunta, ¿cómo
Union.
generamos un nuevo sujeto
And
político
so that's
transnacional?
why I
Porque
have this
creo que
question.
nuestros
How do we
pares,
create this transnational
nosotras argumentamos
political
cotidianamente
subject? I think we
que
need
la
that.
relación bilateral trae graves
The
violaciones a derechos humanos
bilateral
en México que
relation
destruyen el medio
brings with
ambiente.
it human rights
Pero es
violations
real
that
lo que ha
also impact
dicho
the environment.
muy
But
poca gente
in the European
resuena, ¿no?
Union,
O sea, no generamos
that's not resonating
un
with
interés, un
people.
sujeto político
We
que se
can't
niegue a reconocer el
generate
derecho bilateral
an
a
interest in
simple.
that
Sin embargo,
over there.
lo que ha pasado ahora con el
Nevertheless,
Mercosur, por
what's
ejemplo,
happening with
cuando
Mercosur,
los
for example,
intereses económicos
when
de
the
algún
economic
sector
interests of a
se ven
particular
tocados, sí que
sector
salen a
are
las calles y
impacted,
sí que se moviliza
they do
para,
go out into the streets, they
para defenderlos,
mobilize,
¿no? De alguna manera.
and defend their interests.
Un gran ejemplo de las consecuencias de
An
estas
example
propuestas que hicieron ustedes
of the
hace 23
consequences
años
of the proposals
es
that
el
were
Acuerdo
made 10
Global
years ago,
Actualizado.
the updated global
No me gusta
agreement.
llamarle modernizado porque
I don't like
modernizado
to call
pareciera
it
que es como medio, ¿no?
modernized
Pero sí
because
hay
that
alguna
would
palabra ahí
imply that it's
avanzada.
improved.
Este acuerdo
I,
global
I don't think
actualizado
that's the
incluye el
case,
foro de la sociedad
but
civil.
the updated
Nosotros
agreement
llevamos
includes
como 6, 7 años
civil
peleando en la
society
Unión Europea porque nos
spaces.
compartieran este archivo
We've been
que hicieron
battling
público en
for
septiembre
this in
para
the
que ya
European
salga.
Union. It
Bueno,
was
pero
made
ya está
public in September of last
el
year,
traducido todo el acuerdo
and
global en principio,
the
todos los
global
pilares de política y
accord has been
cooperación
translated, the pillars for
y comercio
cooperation
también.
and for commerce.
Y no nos lo daban, y no nos lo dieron, ¿no? Hasta que ya está completamente terminado. Y un señor
They didn't hand it
Comisión del
over.
Exterior Europeo decía, pero bueno, ya
And
lo
a
tienen,
minister of
permítanos
the
un foro
European
de la
Union
sociedad
finally
civil
said, okay,
que va a
well,
ser súper
we've
bueno.
given
Pero
you a
es que
forum for
esto
civil
nos fue escrito hace
society
23 años. ¿No? O sea, menos mal que
participation.
ya la pusieron,
It took
menos mal
23
que
years
solo
to
tardaron
get that.
23 años en
It
ponerla,
took
¿no?
them long enough, but they finally
Entonces, vuelvo a la
established
pregunta,
that.
¿cómo generamos un
So
sujeto político
my question,
colectivo
yes, how do we
transnacional
develop a
para recuperar el respeto a los
transnational
derechos humanos en
collective
México
political
con intereses
subject that
económicos en Europa?
brings together the interests
Muy bien,
that
muy
are
buenas
exist in
preguntas. No podemos
Mexico
ubicarnos
with
en estas
what's happening in
situaciones
the European
geopolíticas
Union? Thank you
agravadas.
very much for highlighting
¿Podría
this the global
responder?
political
Difícil
geopolitical
la pregunta.
dimension.
Esta es la pregunta de los 64,000 millones de pesos, ¿no? Ciertamente. Pero realmente es la única manera de
It's a
pagar esto.
complicated question.
Digamos,
Yes, that's the
el
million-dollar
ALCA,
question
que
indeed.
fue
If you look at
el
ALCA
intento más ambicioso de
in
Tratado de
South
Libre
America, the
Comercio
most
en
ambitious
toda
free
América,
trade
de Estados Unidos,
agreement
fue derrotado.
proposed for Latin America,
Y
it
fue
was defeated.
derrotado por una alianza.
It
Una
didn't move forward
alianza
because of an
que se
alliance.
llamó la Alianza Social Continental
the Continental Social Alliance. And it was a dream that came into fruition, came true in part. It involved different sectors of workers, environmentalists, NGOs, different types of skilled labor, and they had a single objective, and they were able to halt the agreement. Of course, capital always finds ways to recuperate its interests, and so it divided up the playing field, and it's trying to do it country by country. And that's what we got. The Latin American platform that is engaging free trade agreement is very complex. It's a complicated terrain. A lot of the alliances between Europe and Latin America are dominated by NGOs. I think that's fine. These are groups that are doing work, they have intellectual capacities, they have resources, and they're involved in the fight. But we fail to bring in the large workers' organizations. And so right now, if there are difficulties around Europe and Mercosur, it's because of Via Campesina, civil society organization. I might be mistaken, but that is a main actor. So when we have alliance with mass social movements, if we don't have that, you're not going to stop it, or you're not going to be able to modify it. Because with the NGOs that are out there providing resources, capacitation, time, many things, you have that. But if you don't have a mass that's out in the streets, when the negotiations come, and we saw this with the USMCA, when negotiating with the United States, a colleague said to me, look, when you have 1 million people out on the streets, that's when we can address those matters. And it's as simple as that. They're not going to pay attention to the issues without a lot of pressure behind that demand. So as far as how we organize ourselves, how we recuperate the international alliances, that's an open question, but it's vital that that happens sector by sector, country by country. We need an trans-sector alliance. Otherwise, it's not going to work like it has in the past. We have to figure it out.
Perdón, si me permiten, muy rápido, y perdón por las dos colegas que están levantando.
Very briefly, and I'm sorry for the people that have their hands raised. I just wanted to mention one thing. What Alberto is saying, I'm in agreement with that in part. We've never had 1 million people on the streets. There was partial wins with ALCA, and it had to do with the different positions of different governments. This was expressed in the last webinar, at our last conference. There is lack of movement in from what we might call left organizations. When you look at U.S. empire, what are they doing? Including organizations that are against the free trade agreements, for instance, in Europe. The United States will say, we have to support the agreement with Mexico or India or Asia, and that really disorients the landscape. And if we don't address that central problem, well, we can continue to talk about mobilizing people, that we need to do this or that. I'll give you a very clear example. At the start of February, there was a meeting in Panama involving the participation of European and Latin American governments. And Lula Brazil was there, and he addressed very directly the attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of Maduro. And he said something that is very true. He said CELAC didn't even come together to make a declaration about what happened in Venezuela. And that speaks very clearly. That's a very clear signal, or sends a very clear signal. So what are we going to do with progressive organizations, left organizations, whatever you have, that previously opposed these agreements, that were open to creating alternative projects, and that have now taken a different position? And then when you have governments that previously opposed them and now are following that current, what are you going to be able to do? Right now in Mexico, no one thinks that the government is going to reject the agreement. We know that it's going to benefit the European Union more than it's going to benefit Mexico, and we need to understand that clearly. When we talk about a collective political subject, I think that takes years to develop. Of course, it's the million-dollar question. I think there's experiences that are being brought together and are relevant to the issue. There's strong global interest to create mechanisms for international corporations that are binding. Is it going to happen? I don't know. It's been in the works since 2014, but it depends on a lot of parallel projects, but we need to be thinking on those terms.
Okay, vamos a seguir
Respond to the
con
question.
María
Okay,
Elena
we'll go to the
Valdivia,
next
creo que fue la
question.
siguiente
María Elena
primera que
Valdivia,
levantó la
I
mano.
believe she raised her hand first.
Estoy escuchando atentamente
I've been
y
listening
no puedo evitar
closely,
frustrarme
and I can't help but be a bit
porque
frustrated.
constantemente nos preguntan a nosotros, el pueblo, o cuando estamos recibiendo
Constantly,
denuncias y
people ask
quejas,
us
sobre todo
when we
laborales,
receive
cuando hay explotación laboral.
labor
Y
complaints,
la pregunta
labor
constante en
exploitation.
todos
The
estos años es,
question
¿y qué hacen los
is
derechos humanos?
always, and what about the
Entonces, como
human
abogados
rights?
por los derechos humanos, si me frustran todos estos mecanismos y situaciones, y ahorita estaba reflexionando al escucharlos,
And so all of
me
these
duele pensar,
mechanisms
me
become
duele,
very
me duele, porque soy
frustrating.
mexicana, entonces que toda
And
la
I'm
vida
sorry to
hemos
say this
tenido
as a Mexican person.
gobernantes
We've
tontos,
always
voy a
had
utilizar una palabra
dumb
muy fuerte.
leaders, dumb
O
in the
sea,
government.
nunca se ha
I'll
tratado
use that word.
realmente de negociar y
They've
abrirse a una
never really
globalización
tried to
que pudiese
negotiate
ser
and
sana,
engage a type of
a
globalization that is healthy,
un comercio
that contributes to
realmente
well-being,
libre.
to commerce,
Lo que yo estoy percibiendo en
commercial
los últimos
relations
años,
that are
sobre
actually
todo cuando
free.
se trata de
What I've
llevar
been
estas
seeing
denuncias
in recent
y
years, particularly when it
presentarlas
comes to the
ante mecanismos,
conflicts
como decían en
that are
Europa,
then
que
presented to
ni
these
existen en
mechanisms, like,
Europa, pero
as
sí
was
en
said, they don't
Estados
even
Unidos,
exist in Europe, but they do in
donde
the United
muchas veces
States. And many
estas,
times,
estas denuncias toman
the
años
denunciations, the
y
complaints
para
take
lograr
years
siquiera
to be
que
processed,
haya una investigación como debe de
sometimes
ser,
just to have an investigation
también
carried out.
no hay suficientes trabajadores, no tienen suficientes recursos.
There's
Y como
also
alguien aquí
not
decía
enough
que yo
workers or
nunca he querido usar la
people that
palabra
are
dientes,
working to do the
pero hasta en el
investigation. There's not
tema
enough
legal muchas veces nos responde
human
el
resources.
Departamento del Trabajo
And a lot
que
of
no tiene
times, the
suficientes
Department of
dientes
Labor
legales
basically
para
tells us
ir en
we don't
contra de
have
los
legal
empresarios.
teeth.
Además de que a los empresarios les es muy fácil, nos ha pasado en todos
We don't
estos
have
años.
teeth to
O sea,
go
en los últimos
against
años
the
teníamos
business
una
persons that are
investigación
violating this or the
que
businesses
por fin
that
la
are
tenemos
creating
en la
violations.
corte, por ejemplo,
There's a case that
donde
finally
este
got to
empresario
court
se
where
cambió
a
20 veces
particular
el nombre,
business
por
changed its
ejemplo.
name 20 times. That's just to give you an
Entonces, esta
example of what
falta de
it's like.
capacidad
And
realmente
so the
de
lack of
llegar a
real
acuerdos de parte
capacities
de los
to
de los
reach
primeros municipos de
agreements
México
involving
se me hace totalmente absurda
the
en pleno
countries,
2026.
well, it just
Pero
seems
¿qué
really
podemos hacer?
absurd
No lo sé.
as we go into
Quizás
2026. But what
enfocar
can we
más
do?
la
I
lucha
don't
a
know. Perhaps we
legislar
can focus the
sacar a la
struggle
luz y
on
decirle al pueblo la
legislation
realidad.
or on generating visibility so that
Los
people are
foros,
more
organismos
informed,
de
so that
defensa
people know
de
what's
los
going
derechos
on.
humanos,
It's
son las
not
personas por las que
really about the
votas, que no hacen su
mechanisms
trabajo
for
de
rapid response
legislar y
and
resguardar
responding to violations. It's
realmente el
actually has
beneficio
a lot
del
to do with
pueblo.
the people that we're
Hasta ahí,
elected
muchas
to
gracias.
lead and
Sí,
represent
muchas
the
gracias.
people.
Bueno, muy rápidamente, pues era, bajé la mano porque ya
Very
Pablo
briefly,
ponía
I
en el
put my
centro el
hand
tema
down
de cómo nos
because Pablo
articulamos
brought
desde
up the issue
México,
about
pero también
how
haciendo
about coming together
coordinación con
in
algunas
Mexico
organizaciones
and
de la Unión
also
Europea.
establishing links with
Comentarles que
organizations in the
efectivamente hay
European Union.
un esfuerzo de la
I
sociedad
wanted to
civil,
mention that
de
there is a
algunas
civil society
organizaciones
project
que
involving
participan en el diálogo
multiple
de alrededor de la
organizations
Unión
that are
Europea en
engaged
México.
in the
Aquí hay un
dialogues
espacio donde cada
related to the European Union in
participa en
Mexico
estas
agreement.
reuniones.
In
Para ser francos, nos ha
the
costado
meetings,
mucho trabajo en el seguimiento y
it's
las
been really
recomendaciones. Hay
difficult to follow
recomendaciones,
up on the
de pronto hay
recommendations.
voluntad de algunos
Sometimes there's a willingness
embajadores de la
on the
Unión
part of
Europea en dar
the
seguimiento.
European Union ambassadors to
Destacaría
do follow-up
específicamente la
work.
sueca Clara Hollander, quien ha
There's
mostrado
the
mucha
case of
sensibilidad a los
Hollander,
temas mexicanos, específicamente temas de desaparición
or
forzada,
rather,
el tema de
Holland is
migración y
very
derechos
attentive to
humanos,
the
como
issue
otras
of forced
específicamente el tema del
disappearances in
desplazamiento
Mexico,
forzado
also
internacional.
forced
La pregunta muy
displacement
concreta tiene
in
que ver
Mexico.
efectivamente con esto que ya
And
Pablo
the reason
apuntaba.
that they
¿Cómo nos
responded
coordinamos
has to
de
do
una
with
mejor
what
manera
Pablo
y
was saying,
articulada para poder
a
poner los
clear
puntos más
organization,
importantes
taking
respecto
advantage of
al
opportunities
desafío global, por un lado, y por
to
otro
seek
lado también
global
nos
support
tomaría
and get global
algún
attention. So there's
acontecimiento que
that.
mencionen
And
en el
also
tema del
in
desplazamiento
relation
forzado
to
de nuestro
something that
país,
was in the
que
chat about
el
internal force
gobierno no
displacement,
ha
I wanted to say
reconocido
that the
este punto. Este es
government
un
has
tema
not
tan importante que implica
recognized
justamente
this
las
very
grandes
important
inversiones,
issue,
sobre
which
todo
is
las derivadas de
connected
las
to
decisiones
huge
como están
financing.
también en el ojo del huracán,
All
que
of
se
this is in the
promueven
eye
estos
of the
temas del
hurricane,
desplazamiento forzado, además del
and
crimen
there's forced
organizado, como
displacement,
mencionamos,
issues of forced
y sobre este
displacement and
prohibimos.
organized crime
Entonces,
that are swirling all around
yo
that.
vería por ahí como estas
So
dos grandes
I think those are
preguntas de
two
cómo
fundamental
hacemos esta
issues.
articulación y por otro lado,
So
cómo
the fundamental
seguimos
question is, how
impulsando
do
el
we
reconocimiento al
develop that
desplazamiento
global
forzado interno en
actor,
México. También.
and
Gracias.
also how do we
Muchísimas
get
gracias.
gain global visibility? Thank you.
Vamos a ver si nuestros tres ponentes tienen como la
Let's see if
oportunidad de dar unas
our
palabras finales,
panelists
porque ya estamos llegando al final
have any
de
final
nuestra
words. We're
de la sesión.
reaching the end of the
Bueno, quisiera
planned
decir que he
time.
aprendido mucho con ese
Yes, I
seminario.
wanted to say that I've learned a
He agarrado
lot
muchas
from this
ideas.
seminar.
Quiero ratificar lo que dijo
I
Braulio
wanted to
y que es que hay
affirm what
una gran
Braulio
confusión
said,
en
and there's a
la
lot of
izquierda
confusion.
europea por dónde
The,
ir en este momento.
European
Creo
left
que hay
doesn't
que
know which way to
combatir la
move.
idea de que las TLC van a frenar
The
Trump
free trade agreements are
y
going to
que van a
be
salvar
slowed down by
el
Trump,
multilateralismo. No es así.
and
Concretamente, la
multilateralism is
modernización del acuerdo global
also going to be
va
halted.
a aumentar la violación
There's
de
going to
derechos
be
humanos
an increase in
porque
human
da
rights
muchas más
violations
oportunidades
because there
a
are more
las multinacionales
opportunities for
a
the
infringir
multinationals
los derechos
to
humanos, porque hay
restrict
muchos más
that
campos
terrain of human
abiertos,
rights.
desde inversión hasta aranceles.
There's a lot of new
Tercer
things
punto
being developed, for instance,
es
with
que
tariffs
estamos
and
en un
such.
cruce de caminos,
Another thing is that we're at a crossroads.
porque Alberto dijo los acuerdos
Alberto
libre
said
comercio no
that
son
the free trade
reformables
agreements are not
y
reformable. They can't be
Braulio
reformed. And
puso un
Braulio,
par de nuevos campos para aplicar los
he
derechos humanos,
identified
como son
other terrains on
mujeres,
which you
niños,
can advance
migrantes
human
o
rights, including
obligaciones de empresas.
migrants,
Entonces hay
women,
que pensar si vamos
business
a luchar
obligation, business
por
responsibilities.
acabar
So
con
we
los
need to
acuerdos de libre
decide
comercio
if we're
de
going
una
to
vez, porque no
focus on
son
free trade
reformables, o los
agreements and
hacemos
end that or end them altogether,
reformables.
or are
Creo que no
we
hay
going
una
to
única
do
respuesta
something
porque hay
different
mucha
because
gente
we
que está
can't reform
trabajando en
them?
muchos campos, pero
People are
hay que
working in
dar
many different
respuestas
areas,
a esa pregunta.
and
¿Estamos en la
so
reforma
the
o
question is
estamos en
pending.
el no?
Are we going to
Y
reform
para
or
esto
are we going to just
necesitamos
say no?
hablar conjuntamente.
And in order to
No hay
have an answer, we need to come
preguntas
together and
solo en
discuss
Europa
that
o solo en México.
collectively. It can't just be
Gracias otra vez.
responses coming from
Muchas
Mexico.
gracias,
Thanks
Gaby.
again.
Muchísimas gracias a ti. Y Alberto, por favor, adelante.
Hemos tenido algunos triunfos, pero digamos, parciales, ¿no?
We have had some triumphs, but they have been partial. I think we need to do two things. First, we need to analyze anew the text of the new free trade agreement with Europe and trying to detect strong risks for specific sectors of the population. And based on that, then we can do our organizing work and involving the sectors that would be especially impacted by these treaties. We're not going to move them with the discourse of free trade, of neoliberalism. We're going to move them with the concrete effects that we can expect with the free trade agreement. I think we can carry out an effort to identify exactly which are the changes that will continue or that would be new, that would affect the population. It's a slow and difficult and long effort. And I think that the cases that have had success, there's some case of lawsuits in Mexico that were able to win. And that in part was due to because we were able to talk with the investors in those companies. Generally, it's business bureaucrats that carry it out with really strong interests. But when they arrive to small business people who invested in their in actions in the business, when they found out what the real situation is of the harm that the business was doing, things changed. And they said, okay, you either withdraw and that lawsuit. And that's why alliances are important. I think alliances with Europe will allow, in specific cases, to be able to establish channels of dialogue to carry out pressure. I think that these are paths that civil society can build. Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. I don't know, Braulio, if you want to take the microphone briefly, because we're over time. Yes, briefly. Two things. Yes, I begin my speech talking about the project of the European Union in 1995. At that point, the European Union hadn't signed any free trade agreements with the countries in Latin America. There were agreements, partial or full agreements. Things have changed. There's been agreements in Central America, Mexico, Chile with Mercosur, Colombia, Ecuador. And so these agreements, these treaties continue. And what we have done since then, up through now, has been a really beautiful opportunity to reconnect with Maria and others. It's to be able to coordinate, to be able to develop forms of collective work, creating a collective political actor, a political subject. I think we're in time to be able to create alliances amongst organizations in Latin America and Europe, Central America and Europe, Mexico and Europe. And I believe that there are things that need to be done in Europe. I think there's things that need to be done in Latin America and specifically in Mexico. And as Alberto said, this requires a lot of effort. The advances are not one, but we don't have an alternative. It's like, or we come together and pull together and are able to face up this kind of offensive and create alternatives, or we're going to be smashed by the consequences. And so it's really a call to how we can coordinate, how we can advance proposals, and insisting that there are possibilities to do it in Europe, in Spain, in Germany, etc., and also to limit any kind of confusion. I also think that the free trade agreements are not reformable. I think, we can make positive changes that can be improved. I don't think they're reformable. In parallel, we need to show that there are rights to continue struggling for and that are not recognized. For example, the issue of migrants here in Europe is a really fundamental issue. And you're living it in Mexico in relation to United States and in relation to other countries that are arriving from Cuba, from Haiti, from other countries. And this should be a really central issue at the world level. How do we coordinate efforts so that the rights of the migrants and the trade agreements are a fundamental issue that are attended to in all the countries? I think that would allow us to advance. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much to all three presenters. Thank you very much for sharing and also for emphasizing this idea that it's more necessary than ever to weave alliances beyond the existing current alliances. And I think with that, we have arrived to the end. Thank you very much to the presenters who have shared with us. It is really important. And I just would like to say that it's not been 23 but 29 years that we have been involved in this, and the global agreement was ratified in 1997, and so it's been since then that we have been involved in this, and I've learned a whole lot today as well from your presentations. And I would like to say to you as well that there's upcoming documents to present, and we will be informing you just about the agreements, but in a determined moment, we will put them up in action. And what is being said about like how to construct a political subject, the idea also to take away these confusions that with all the chaos that there is that's gets mixed in. Well, this kind of activity, this kind of seminar, are to be able to clarify collectively amongst all of us what are the possibilities, where are the resistances, what are the proposals that we could have that exist and that we have been seeing throughout this time. And now the situation is more complicated. We can still do a lot. And always remember that I don't know if they exist in reality or in mythology, but David and Goliath existed, and we can find the right stones in order to go up against Goliath.